Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, John.
Good morning, Rod. So, thank you for all coming to this workshop, and it's going to be an open discussion type of a workshop. So we're trying to get ideas out, consolidate what we have, or your thoughts from the board and from the cities. The way we're going to run this particular meeting, we're going to have a staff presentation. We'll have public comment. Then we will close public comment, and then we'll bring it back to the council and cities for questions. Hold all your questions to the very end of the presentation, please, because we're going to have a lot to be seen, and so just make sure you write them down, have something to write with. And then we have 3 questions at the very end of what our goal is. In the packet, we were trying to decide 3 basic questions, and are these alternatives compatible with city plans? Are these are there fatal flaws in the alternatives? Are there changes that should be made or other alternatives that should be analyzed? When I was reading this particular report, there was some new things here and some things that I hadn't anticipated, but this is the staff plan is to just get us food for thought, and we can go from there. So we're going to start off with introduction. So we do our roll call, and since this is a work study session, we don't necessarily need a quorum, so we can continue as we move ahead. And so, would you like to take a roll call for us, please?
Member Landry?
Here.
Member Sinks?
Here.
Member Bruins?
Here.
Member Jensen? Alternate Member Saya? Member Turner? Member Campus?
Here.
Member Klein? Alternate Member Fong? Vice Chairperson Miller?
Here.
Chairperson McAllister?
Here.
About a quorum.
Okay, and we're going to have representatives from the cities. So there's name tags from those the transportation departments of our various cities that are here, and hopefully all those are up at the table. Your input will be appreciated today also. And that being said, we got about 2 hours. Hopefully we get this wrapped up sooner than, but we're in no rush. Our goal is to get a broader, or define our alternatives. Staff is going to come back in May to give us a little more definition of what we're trying to do. And then we would try to get this to the board sooner than later, because some of us are on a timeline. So that's what Ms. Broom.
So, Chair, if you don't mind, and if staff, if you don't mind, I want to add to the introduction, and that is to address the staff members who are taking time out of their morning to join us. I want to make it clear why you are here, because the Policy Advisory Board members requested your attendance. And in our discussions over the last several months about SR 85, and I don't know if staff's going into any of this, but in our discussions about SR 85, SR 85 has major congestion on it. We have a problem we need to try and solve. However, SR 85 also does not meet the stereotypical type of corridor where there is a lot of density along the corridor, because SR 85 actually kind of cuts through many of our single-family home type of communities versus anything that has any resemblance of any density. So we kind of have a conundrum here, kind of a catch-22. And so part of your job here, and it's not just the transportation people here, some of you are planning people and such, is really trying to understand how and what the plans are from the cities as well, in terms of where we either have, where we might have plans for direct density or increased density along the corridor, but also things that are within a reasonable distance of the corridor where there might be some opportunities and plans for density, which would then, in my layman's term, become kind of a node, so that we can maybe have that collection point at one of those nodes and then bring that traffic on to SR 85. So we're not asking you to just sit here and listen to the hot wind that's going to come out of us Policy Advisory Board people, but to start thinking about some of those things, because if we really want to come up with the right solution, we really need to understand the land use patterns, because VTA has no control over land use patterns. It's the cities that have that. So with that as a little bit of background, that's why you're here. So we do expect to hear from you and to help us understand and to also think about what would be done differently in your cities if we did have a corridor that actually had something that was meaningful in terms of moving masses of people. Thank you. Is that okay?
Perfect, thank you. So now, since this is a public presentation, this portion of the agenda is reserved for people desiring to address the committee on any matter not on the agenda. Is anybody interested in discussing anything that's not on the agenda? Okay. For 2 minutes?
Did you get my card? So, good morning, and my name is Roland LeBrun. I live in San Jose, and I drove up Highway 85 this morning. I'm addressing you on something that's essentially not on the agenda. First of all, I would like to bring your attention that MTC just did for the San Mateo managed lanes. And don't quote me on this, but from memory, it's 6 miles. Don't ask me how they ended up with $500 million. But the key point is that Google and Facebook together have contributed $50 million to these lanes. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention, because I haven't seen this in the packet, is that when MTC looked at it, they looked at it regionally as to how they were managing lanes in the 9 Bay Area counties. And they're thinking along the lines of HOV3+, maybe doing something special for electric vehicles, HOV2+. But anyway, if you do some basic calculations and you're assuming 2,000 vehicles, single occupant vehicles per lane per hour, the capacity of HOV3+ with 2,000 vehicles is 6,000. That's the same capacity as running a 50-passenger bus every 30 seconds. And that capacity is actually nearly double Caltrain's current capacity. So I just thought I'd put it down there because I haven't seen this in the packet. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to address the board with items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will close the public presentation and we will move to the staff presentation. This is an informational item. Again, we are just here to gather thoughts and consolidate them. And as I say, we're going to let Adam, thank you for coming, and he will give a presentation, and then we will hold all of our questions to the very end.
Okay, thank you, and good morning. I was going to give an introduction explaining why we're all here, but Member Bruins already did that so well that I'll skip to the next slide. A few slides to cover just before we get started. I want to start off with some introductions in a moment, then we'll give the staff presentation, then we have the discussion at the end, and I'd like to get through the presentation as quickly as I can so we can have a maximum amount of time to hear from everybody sitting around the table. Also just wanted to touch on the roles. VTA staff will be doing a lot of listening. We have a few questions for you today. We're asking our PAB members to think to the larger goals as they are well suited and advise us on the alternatives. We're asking city staff to weigh in about the compatibility of some of the ideas we'll discuss today with city plans and how things match with city transportation goals, where growth is likely to occur, where station locations make sense, that sort of topic that's in a more detailed aspect of planning. So I'll pause here to do introductions. I'm Adam Berger. I'm a senior transportation planner and the project manager of this study.
Chris Augenstein, Director of Planning and Programming with VTA. Jim Lawson, I have to think about which title to use. All right, Government Affairs Director works.
Board Assistant, VTA.
I'm Roger Lee, City of Cupertino. George Schroeder, City of Senegal Planning.
Dawn Cameron, City of Mountain View.
Rod Sinks, council member, City of Cupertino, and one of the people who helped establish this PAB.
Susan Landry, Vice Mayor, City of Campbell.
John McAllister, City of Mountain View Chair.
Howard Miller, Saratoga, Vice Chair.
Jeannie Bruin, City of Los Altos.
Johnny Camus, City of San Jose.
Matt Morley, Town of Los Gatos.
Jessica Khan, City of Montesino.
Jason Paul, City of San Diego.
All right, thank you. To cover a little bit of background for why we're here and what our charge is for today, Want to talk about how this effort got started. There's of course, a desire to improve transportation along Highway 85. The traffic is very frustrating, but there are some larger goals. And Member Sinks has spoken in the past to issues like teacher retention that the Cupertino schools are facing. And I'm sure that sort of issue exists in many other professions for folks trying to access this area. We're having a difficult time getting in. The ultimate objective of this study is not to pick a perfect project, but rather to inform a recommendation that will go to VTA's Board of Directors. Now, before this body was formed, before this study was started, VTA was on a path to build an express lane on Highway 85, to convert the existing HOV lane to an express lane and to build a new express lane in the wider, unused median section between Highway 280 and Highway 87. An express lane is a lane that allows HOV vehicles to use for free, but also allows single occupant vehicles to buy their way into the lane, paying a fee that is dynamic depending on the level of congestion in that lane. That effort has been put on pause until we complete this study and the PAB makes a recommendation to VTA's Board of Directors. The board will ultimately have to decide what sort of strategy they want to put on the corridor. So that's the background. Leading up to this meeting, we have talked a good deal about the travel market on the corridor. We've identified that it is a peaked directional travel market, that transit may be a competitive, appealing option during times of congestion, but likely not at other times. The land uses along the corridor present a challenge to generating transit ridership. We've talked about physical constraints. The northern portion of the corridor is narrower than the sort of middle section between 280 and 87. And we have light rail already in place south of 87. Those are going to create unique design considerations. And we've also talked in the past about a preference for a rubber-tired type transit option here, really stating that light rail, which can only be used by trains, doesn't really give the flexibility or the throughput and has some other disadvantages such as a high cost and high maintenance cost compared to a rubber-tired solution. We can revisit that decision today or recertify it as we move forward.
Adam, just briefly, when you go to a different screen, since we're not, just let us know that you're.
Right. I've got that advantage.
So we have the packet here. So.
On slide 9, goals for today.
With no page numbers on ours.
It's really small. It's small.
They're there. They're just real small.
It's an eye test.
Saving ink. We really want to receive your input today, and I hope that everybody will get a chance to contribute on all of the final questions at the end of the presentation. We also have an objective of moving closer to selecting a slate of final alternatives. We don't have to get it all right today. If we do, that's great, but I expect there may be some future iteration, and we may want to establish additional meetings if needed to accomplish that. We do have an objective put on staff by the board here to try to close this study by the end of the year. So we'd like to move quickly, but we also want to make sure we're doing it in a thorough, responsible manner and talking about everything that needs to be talked about before we move forward. So what you will see in this presentation are 3 initial alternatives that have been developed by VTA staff. At this point, these are nothing more than ideas. They are put out here to help stimulate conversation and to start talking about some of the issues that different alternatives may place on your communities. We want to hear what you welcome and do not welcome, slide 10. These have been put together with some fiscal consideration. Alternatives that have lots of stations are going to have more sparse infrastructure changes between stations, and those that have fewer stations. Do you say we don't match, Chris?
No, this is slide 6.
We had the introduction slides added.
Okay, so they're out of sequence.
So we're approach to developing initial alternatives.
I know, it's just.
Okay. So we tried to have some fiscal constraints in mind so that we wouldn't necessarily have one project alternative that was much more expensive than others. And of course, the less it costs, the easier it is to do. We're looking at emulating infrastructure that exists in other cities. We haven't been too creative in coming up with what stations might look like. We're just trying to copy what other places look like, although we also don't want to eliminate consideration of new creative ideas that might be better. We're just not pushing the envelope with these alternatives. And I want to point out that these are put together so that we can consider what sort of elements of projects we like and which elements we do not like. In the end, the PAB does not have to pick a specific alternative, say alternative 2B, to recommend to the Board of Directors, but rather you can mix and match components you like about different projects or different goals or design elements. That'll be really useful for helping give VTA direction moving forward. So the next slide, a big graphic photo. This is an on-ramp station like we see in Seattle. In this case, you're looking at cars that are coming towards you, about to enter the freeway, and the station is just built into a little extra asphalt off to the side. Minimal infrastructure, but to access it, the bus must get over to the right lane. Another design that I'm calling median at grade, where the station exists in the median of the roadway, with other lanes at the same elevation, side to side. This type of station can be particularly or have some particular needs in terms of right-of-way, and it may be difficult to fit these in. This will be something we can discuss. And the last one is what I'm calling a median overpass station. Another example here from Seattle, going sort of left to right is 128th Street, and north-south is Highway 405. In the middle of that ramp you see going north, there are bus stops built in to the right and left side of it. That's a direct HOV ramp. The next slide will zoom right into the middle of that intersection and take the same view. You can see the HOV direct connector going from the top of the overpass with the bus stops on the right and left side. So let's jump into the alternatives. So the no project alternative, always a component of an alternatives analysis. This is what would happen if something else didn't happen. So for this one, we are not imagining any transit service. This is VTA pursuing an express lane in the corridor. There would be a new lane added in the wider section between 280 and 87, and the rules are HOV 2+ single occupant vehicles paying a fee. And this really has no right-of-way impacts in this design. 3 lanes going north, just new rules on the median adjacent lane. In the middle portion of the corridor between 280 and 87, we've added an additional lane. This is on the 280 to 87 slide. The additional lane has been added in there in red. So you see where the new ones are. And then on the next slide, with the south of Highway 87, we have the light rail in the median and the HOV lane converted to an express lane.
Adam, could you
Yes.
also help us understand, you have some spots where it looks like there's a lane in the width of the lanes and open
Right.
spots,
So these diagrams are just to show roadway configurations. We haven't measured anything out. We haven't looked to see if this will fit in the right-of-way. We can surmise that some of these that add additional lanes may have right-of-way impacts, some cases probably likely right-of-way impacts, but we're not getting so technical at this level of analysis. Thank you. The second alternative, which I'm calling the fast travel speed alternative, is designed to move people by transit. Yes?
Sorry. We're trying to follow what you're saying. Can you again go back to what page we're turning?
So it's
Where?
15.
15.
Now we're
So-
on 15?
I will subtract 4 from what the number I see.
No, is it 15?
15, because we're now.
15.
Okay.
So if you back up just for 1 second, Adam, where everybody's kind of confused, is there are, for this alternative, there are 3 pictures that show the lane configurations north of 280, and then from 280 to 87, and then from 87 to 101.
Correct.
So those 3 sides represent that one option, depending on where you're looking. And then when you get to page 15, now it's a different alternative, and pictures that go with it too.
Correct.
I believe the alternatives will show you north of 280, south of 87, and in between.
In between, yep.
Right.
So there's 3.
We've broken the highway into 3 sections
For
based
each
on the
alternative.
unique design constraints in each portion.
Okay, and the other thing for clarification is on slide 13, so even though we're calling this the no project express lane, that middle segment from 280 to, from 280 down to 87, it is adding an additional lane, and
Yes.
therefore you would have 2 express lanes.
Correct.
/ HOV lanes. So even though it's a no project, this is
There would be
project.
changes.
this is a project.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that we all understand. So this would be, the middle segment would change in the no project.
No project is the
Okay.
express lane. Yeah.
So the red is new lanes.
So the red is new pavement, new lanes, and it would be used as express lane, just like the HO.
So right now we have.
And the gray is,
That's-
Existing lanes. And we'll use that red and gray color coding throughout the entire presentation.
okay, so hang on, sorry. The gray in the middle is the median.
Yes.
Yes, so where you see text in gray or black, that's an existing lane. Where you see text in red, that's a new lane.
She's
Right.
talking about the grant.
So this is construction of a new lane.
Yeah, so the red
Yes.
ink on our slides are a new lane that would be constructed, and it would be used the same way as the HOV. This would be an express lane configuration.
So when 85, the new section of 85 was built from here south to 87, well, all the way to 101, I guess, right?
No,
At that time, the median was reserved for transit,
Correct.
and it's never been utilized. The 1992 plan had it reserved for light rail. That was put in as one of the options in Measure A 2000. It was never built. Other projects were funded. Now, given staff's very pessimistic view of whether light rail makes any sense, in our prior meeting, we said, let's look at rubber solutions, rubber tire solutions. And the idea, right, would be to expand the freeway where it's easy to do for those rubber tire solutions, taking those median lanes that had once been reserved for light rail and enable high-capacity vehicles to take advantage of that real estate.
So-
From here north, we don't have extra right-of-way the whole way up, so it's going to be a harder problem. But we recognize that if all we did was create transit lanes, from here south, we wouldn't be solving the bigger problem, which is to bring people
Rod, we're going to
all the
hold
way
those
north
comments
to-
to the end, so.
Yeah,
We
I'm
were
just
just
trying to be
asking
helpful here.
clarifications for the slide, so once we
Okay.
get that, we can get him rolling.
Yeah.
Sure. So I will move over to the fast travel speed alternative, which is your slide 15. The objective on this one is to make transit as fast as possible. So that is making a lower number of stations overall through the corridor so that the bus doesn't have to stop that often along the way. Of course, the less stations you have, the less people who have access to the transit service, since there are going to be some folks who live near the corridor but aren't near a station. So there's an access and speed trade-off here. We are imagining that there would be a new lane constructed for the entire length of 101, and that the rules for that lane would be HOV 5+. You've got some big diagrams in front of you, some 11 by 17s that show all of the cross sections at once for each alternative that may be useful for comparing as we move along. So we have imagined 7 station locations. Now, these were selected based on where current transit routes exist, where density exists, and some moderate spacing along the corridor. We're happy to revisit any of these decisions, but we're very high level at this point.
Did you consider park and ride opportunity with these, or were these just picked where we crossed major bus routes?
These were where we crossed major bus routes. Park and ride will be a feature of a alternative we'll get to in a moment, but we can always reconfigure it, mix and match sort of project elements as we go along.
Right.
And Adam,
Okay, could we hold the questions?
Oh.
Let him finish
Sure.
up. These are just get us to think, so we can get this done.
So the idea with HOV 5+ is that would be transit and private shuttles, and they would have virtually no other vehicles in the lane to slow them down. So you're getting an assurance of great speed, great predictable transit service, but it is a lane that may not be moving as many people as if it were a different type of use. In the 280 to 87 segment, which would be your slide 18, we are adding an additional lane in the median. We don't expect there to be right-of-way impacts there because the space exists today. And on the next slide, which is your 19, I have a diagram of what a station might look like. And I'll note here that the HOV lane goes right up to the edge of the station. So the transit bus might stop, but a private shuttle would have to wait behind that vehicle before moving, or it would have to merge over into the HOV 2+. By only adding one additional lane here, or really not really adding another lane in this segment, I think there would be less right-of-way impacts. We'll look at a different configuration a little bit later on. On slide 20, which is the south of Highway 87, I'm imagining adding an additional lane as well adjacent to the light rail in the median. That may have right-of-way impacts. We'll have to see with future analysis. And finally, a station location. And this is where I've imagined one of those overpass stations like we saw on I-405 in Seattle, where a ramp that goes up to the station is added adjacent to the median there by the light rail. This gets us to a 12-lane wide, if you count the light rail as a travel lane configuration, which may have very significant right-of-way impacts, but it would be a way to squeeze a station into that area along the median where we're a little bit limited because of light rail infrastructure that currently exists. So the next alternative, which I'm calling the maximized throughput alternative, which starts on your slide 22, envisions a few more stations. So in the last one we had 7 stations, which makes 42 possible origin and destination combinations. This gets up to 10, which gives us 90 possible origin and destination combinations. This one would not add an express or a new lane as such a great length, only from 101 in the north down to Highway 87. When we did our traffic analysis in our travel market analysis, we found that the most severe congestion along the corridor existed in the portion north of 280. And while there was some congestion, or north of 87, while there was some congestion south of 87, it was not getting to as slow a speed or lasting for as long as the other part of the corridor. And also 2+ would be the rule for using this lane. So I'm going to take a brief detour into some traffic engineering theory, which I think might be important to understand the strategy here. So this chart, which is probably very familiar to traffic engineers, has on the left speed, which roughly correlates to the density of vehicles in a lane. The more vehicles in the lane, the slower it goes. Then on the bottom, we have the vehicle throughput, how many vehicles per hour per lane can be carried. When you're traveling at a fast speed, you have wider spacing between vehicles, and so you see a lower total volume of vehicles going through that lane. As you slow down and you get closer to sort of this magic zone around 35, 40 miles per hour, you get a combination of fast enough vehicle speeds, but also enough vehicles on the corridor that you maximize your vehicle throughput at about 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. Then once travel speeds get slower than that, it starts having a detrimental effect to throughput. And you see slower and slower speeds getting down to when it's basically stopped at the bottom. So that rightmost point of the parabola there is a great place to land in terms of maximizing throughput. But what we're seeing right now on Highway 85 is we're coming in a little bit lower than that so many people are using the freeway that not that many people can use the freeway. We've sort of exceeded our efficiency here. And this is where economists would advise us that we need to do something to encourage that bubble to get closer up to the maximum throughput. And so this alternative tries to aim for this green bubble that I've drawn on here in slide 24. It would be where we're moving fast enough that it's a pleasant, convenient travel speed, but we haven't quite gotten to the point where we're actually seeing a lower throughput. And since the rules on this alternative are HOV2+, it wouldn't just be vehicles moving through that lane, it would be 2 people or more per vehicle, which really can improve the person throughput we're seeing there, getting it up in the range to, I think, 3,000 to 4,500 people per lane per hour, which would be a big efficiency over the general use lanes and probably what we're seeing today. So in this alternative, we've imagined 10 stations, 90 possible origin-destination combinations. More stations means more stopping, so probably a lower transit speed than the fast transit alternative. And now on slide 26, looking at the initial configurations. In the portion north of 280, I'm imagining a HOV2+ lane being added, which may have some right-of-way impacts. In the next slide on page 27, that lane continues, and there should be adequate space in the median to accommodate that lane without impacts presently. Where there is a station, which you use on your slide 28, I've imagined that because many HOVs are using the lane, there's not going to be much tolerance to stop behind the bus while the bus boards passengers. So in that case, I've added a bypass lane for cars to go around, but this gets us up to 10 lanes plus a station in the median, which could have some right-of-way impacts. We'll have to do future analysis to see if we can fit this sort of configuration in. On the next slide, page 29, I'm imagining basically the same configuration that exists today south of Highway 87. So on the last initial alternative that we've come up with, it's one that I'm calling maximize access. And this is really the express lanes plus transit stations is an easy way to think about this. I've put in about as many stations as I could imagine fitting in 14. So now we're up to 182 possible origin-destination combinations along the corridor, but our trade-off is that because the bus is stopping more frequently, it's not going to go as quickly. This one imagines a new lane from 280 just to 87, so the same expansion as the express lanes. And the rules on the new lane would be that it would be dynamically priced for single occupant vehicles. Once vehicle speeds start to decline below a certain point, the price to enter the lane becomes higher, and in that way we hope to keep the volume of vehicles around the optimal throughput point. This one also imagines some of the other amenities, like park and ride lots at station adjacent locations, and maybe some other infrastructure like kiss and ride curbs, places to store bicycles, or places to store scooters. We've talked at previous meetings about the travel shed challenge that we would experience around stations in this corridor. About 90% of VTA's transit riders arrive at their station by foot, but people are generally not willing to walk more than about 10 or 15 minutes to get to a high-quality transit stop, which could really limit how far around a station we could draw people to use the transit service. The hope here with providing additional infrastructure is that we might be able to induce that shed to become larger. People could drive and park, they could ride their bikes, feel secure that the bike is going to be fine all day while they're gone. Really try to get a bigger crowd of potential transit users. So revisiting that curve, we're now on page 31. We're aiming for that blue circle right around the maximum throughput for vehicles point, controlling that with dynamic pricing to make sure we don't get any slower and more saturated and lose our throughput, person throughput. On the next slide with the map, I've imagined 14 stations. That's a lot of stations. We can discuss whether this is too many when we get to the discussion at the end. On the first configuration slide, which would be your slide 34, I'm imagining no changes to lane configuration north of I-280, so no impacts, keeping it just as it would be today. If there are stations in this area, they would have to be located at on-ramps or off-ramps, which would mean that the bus would switch between probably using the median lane and merging over to access those on-ramp stations. In the section between 280 and 87, now on page 34, I'm imagining that the additional lane would be added that would have transit as an eligible use, just like the express lane. And where there is a station, I'm imagining a similar bypass lane that we saw, now slide 35, to the last configuration, where all the vehicles using that median lane would be able to bypass the bus while it makes its stop at the station. Page 36, showing the south of 87 configuration. There is no physical change, and like the northern section, the buses would have to use on-ramp or off-ramp stations. So I want to touch quickly on operating plans. We've been talking about physical infrastructure so far, but there's another dimension to each alternative, which is what we should model in terms of the level of transit service that goes on there. And I first want to talk about something that's new since our last PAB meeting, which is that VTA has released its final transit service plan for when our BART service begins and we switch over to our new 90/10 ridership coverage service. We had the next network plan that would have increased our service level, and it's increased our hours that we operate annually. And the board has recommended that we decrease service hours on that to bring it to a financially sustainable place. And part of doing that, we've proposed reducing the amount of hours spent on express buses. We currently spend about $10 million a year on express bus service, and when that service model was developed going back decades, we did that with the help of federal funding, chipped in a few $1 million a year that helped support the high cost of carrying peak period directional service. About 2015, that funding stream dried up, and VTA has been absorbing the entire cost of the funding since then. And now that we're thinking about financial sustainability, we've made a recommendation that'll go to the board on May 2nd that a express bus model as it exists today doesn't really make sense. We would like to find a way to continue it, but using a financial partnership with private employers that benefit from the service. And we're going to be exploring that in the coming months. We are capping the amount of VTA spending in our proposal to $5 million, so half of what it currently is. And we do not know at this point if private companies will be very interested in this idea or maybe not that interested at all. And so there's a bit of uncertainty on our side about how much transit service we're going to be able to afford to operate in this corridor, if demand for it under this business model will exist at all. So we'll be exploring that in the next few months, putting together an express bus business plan, but it's something to think about at this point. We also need to think about, for our transit ridership modeling for these alternatives, what frequencies we want, whether we should be looking at a peak period service or an all-day service, or even an all-day versus or weekdays or every day. In the travel market analysis, we found that the market where transit is competitive is generally restricted to peak periods in the peak travel flow direction. My guidance on this would be to look at peak period service and maybe a few different frequencies within there, 15 minutes or 30 minutes or hourly. This is one of the questions that we'll be discussing very shortly. So this is the last slide in my presentation. We're going to turn it over to a group discussion at this point. Oh, yes, sir.
Yes, we're going to go to public.
Go.
For there, if anybody has a public comment on this particular item, then we will close public comment after this. And then as we get into the board or the panel here, I'd like you to ask questions. Get everybody a chance to ask their questions, then we could go to comments. So if you could hold off your comments once you've heard everybody, had an opportunity to speak, and that would help facilitate it. Okay? Rolling.
Thank you. So, what did I just do? Oh,
And you
sorry.
have 2 minutes, please. And if anybody else who would like to speak, if you have a card, hand it over to our board assistant.
So, where do I start here? I really don't think that express lanes are the way to go. I mean, what we want is managed lanes. And if at some point the managed lanes is, well, we have got some spare capacities, yes, by all means, allow people to buy in and run, a single occupant cars in there. Our primary mission, and it should be the VTA's mission, is solutions that move you. We've got to move people. We've got to move thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Because if we don't, we're going to start impacting the livelihood of those large companies we have in the Bay Area. I don't want to see stations in there. Stations are going to kill the budget on day one. Use existing infrastructure. Look at what Google and Facebook do. They look at what's out there and they use it. And this is how they're moving the people. And by the way, I've got it on very good authority that Google, if they had an opportunity, would really not be interested in running a bus system. They basically don't have a choice. Don't assume from day one that the VTA are going to be running on the system. Just provide the infrastructure, leave it open and flexible, and then people will use it as appropriate. I mentioned HOV trippers, which is something MTC is talking about. Now, in terms of phasing, we clearly want to look at the section between, I would say, 87 and 280, which is feasible. But you want to look at 4 sections. You want to look at 17 to 280, I would start there. I would actually start with the northbound lane between 17 and 280. And then basically you got the other 4. You got the southbound direction and then between 17 and 87. And you phase it, based on what you think is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Does anybody from the public have any other comments? Okay, we will close the public portion of this particular option, and we will bring it back to the board for questions. And as I say, once we get our questions, and then we will go for comments. But before that, Adam, could you just sort of highlight one other thing for us, please?
Sure. So you are holding up the first page of the packet, which is a matrix comparing all of the alternatives in a grid format. A little bit complex. I've color-coded it by packet with some different questions: physical configuration, operating plan, and potential sources of funding for the service.
So this is sort of a matrix we can work with to
Hopefully.
pick and choose a little bit, maybe?
I recognize there's a lot to think about here, so I tried to put as much of it on paper as possible. One other thing to point out is that there's more city staff sitting in this room than have been able to join us at the table. And so when we go around and do our roundtable discussion questions, some of them may be popping up to chime in. So we'll just maybe ask them to say their name before they
Okay.
jump
When
in.
they come up to speak, then they can introduce themselves. Okay. I'll start with the vice chair.
Sure, mine are some basic questions just to start. So I'm trying to figure out a little bit about the station configurations, none in specific. I get what's on the corridor, but my understanding is people on the corridor aren't ending like at Middlefield or El Camino. What's the vision for off-corridor, particularly at the two ends? Will this route somehow extend into the job centers in Mountain View? Will it land at a park and ride in the south? What's outside of the corridor?
One of the benefits of taking a rubber-tired solution is that once you reach the end of the corridor, you can go off in any direction you'd like. So that's a benefit for private shuttles, also a benefit for VTA transit that we would operate on there. I'm aware that there are a lot of areas that are logical destinations, north of 101, down in the Palo Alto area, a little bit off the corridor, where we could have transit go after it moves along this corridor. As far as people being dropped off at the stations, we do have the first mile, last mile challenge there, but perhaps with certain amenities or selecting the right station location to minimize those access challenges would make sense.
But I mean, to model this, won't you need to know, and I'm picking on the north side, but wouldn't you need to know where in Mountain View was sort of essentially the last stop?
Our computer model breaks the entire county down into hundreds of zones. So we can get as specific as a zone, which might be the size of a block. So that's a level of specificity we're working with. Any station location within a zone will give us the same output from our model. So
Okay, I would argue that there is a zone north of 101, which is the terminus of the north side. But that's a comment.
That's a
You didn't
comment,
need to make that.
Thank you for catching yourself.
My second question is, we're going to model our transit options, but we're also going to model corporate shuttles in the same space, since the way you labeled it HOV 5+.
yes, based on the video counts that we did of the corridor earlier, we can estimate the corporate shuttle volumes at different locations along the corridor, and we'll build that into our throughput totals.
Okay, and then for each location, you have to come up with some sort of station assumption. Is that going to be based in theory or reality? We're going to go out on tape measure and say we can fit this kind of station there, or is it just going to be like a rough swag? We'll do a...
For the purpose of modeling ridership, the precise, will it fit, will it won't fit, isn't so necessary to get that number. There's an entirely separate feasibility question that goes on with this, whether there's enough right-of-way, whether the station can fit in there, and we'll be providing feedback, answering both of those questions in the final report.
Okay, and then in terms of these stops, again, the generic, some of your models are just assuming we're going to stop in the Guideway somehow or another. Other ones are assuming somehow we're going to get off the freeway and be at a loop through part of Cupertino, or a on-ramp, off-ramp. I mean, how far are you going to model each one of those?
So far, I've only imagined a linear transit route going along the corridor and then perhaps going somewhere else when it reaches the ends. If we want to consider deviations, we can always come up with that routing and build it into our alternatives.
I wasn't really thinking deviations. It was really like a station configuration related question. So for example, there's the station in the middle versus the station in the on-ramp and off-ramp, which means a bus potentially has to move in and out of a whole bunch of lanes. There was a discussion at Cupertino and De Anza it being sort of a glorified transit center where you'd still be sort of on-ramp, off-ramp, but there'd be a little tiny, 200-yard loop that you would drive around for pickup and drop off. Will those get modeled or just some basic assumptions?
If all of the input we receive tells us that that is a good thing to look at, we can certainly model that. I will note that just based on our time and budget constraints, we can't model everything that we want. If we could come up with maybe 4 or so physical configurations and then maybe 2 or maybe max 3 operating plans and maybe routing plans for each, that'd be about as much as we can handle.
Yeah.
But we can look at those details if this body wants to.
Yeah, I think figuring out how to limit this is going to be the important part. That was a comment, sorry.
Mr. Sinks?
Thank you very much. Well, I'll just second many of Howard's points. I kind of wonder why we would like your opinion on why we wouldn't bring this all the way up to North Bay Shore in Mountain View. John, are you listening? John? I want you to hear this.
Okay. Text me.
Text you? No. This is a public meeting, dude, and you're the chair. So it seems to me that if North Bay Shore is actually, Mountain View has done such a great job in planning a lot of housing in North Bay Shore. We have not only Google, but a whole diversity of businesses in that area. It just seems to me that if we do need a station that enables people to quickly get to the Caltrain station. Very important, I think, to everybody coming from the south. But then to fail to get to North Bay Shore by some means, either because the city's got a connection there, maybe VTA says we're stopping at Middlefield and we'll let Mountain View get up there, but somehow, right, we have to get people all the way to North Bay Shore efficiently for this to work. And I wondered if you had a comment about that.
Sure. So there's nothing that would stop a bus from traveling beyond the corridor. I've just constrained the physical changes to what's within the corridor as we're allowed under Measure B, which tells us to look between 101 and 101. On the operating side, we can certainly explore having the buses travel up into the employment areas.
Okay.
And a logical way to do that would be to look at the routes that serve those areas today and just imagine all those stops appended at the end of one of these routes.
So with non-Measure B money, we could figure out how to finish to North Bay Shore, is what you're saying, from 101.
Right. Measure B is only contributing a very tiny amount of money to operating funding, and with that, it's for frequent all-day services. So this would come out of our regular operating funding route, or operating budget that VTA handles.
Let me just point out, too, that there's a whole express lanes program, a managed lanes program that VTA has ongoing. We're building lanes on 237 right now, at 101. So this project wouldn't just go off into the ether. It would connect to two existing projects in the north end anyway.
Yeah. It seems to me that, with all the housing Mountain View is constructing there, right? This is for more than corporate shuttles. This is for people living at the top of the corridor.
So
I was just asking, but it sounds like my question is being answered here. So. Thank you,
Let me be
John.
tough on that. I want questions, not comments.
I know. I like Howard. Am very curious as to why we wouldn't. If I look at some of these diagrams, the fast travel speed alternative intrigues me because it seems like we want to move the needle on more people using transit. If all we get is a bunch of cars with 1 or 2 people, we've kind of failed to really optimize use of this corridor in a future where we're offering a speed advantage. So I guess my question would be to you is, in this fast travel speed alternative, you're showing in only one segment station. Could we not do that, and why wouldn't you include that for the segments north of 280? Like say at El Camino, where you have a major PAMP facility, say at Middlefield, which I would think would be the logical connection to the Caltrain station. So I recognize, with this in and out, get off the freeway anywhere and so forth, people could potentially do that, but I'm rather concerned with folks who in my city, right, we've just talked about, well, this hit the newspapers this week. In my council, we talked about shuttles operating basically within the city. We do have PDAs along our corridors. Could we, what would it look like to have a few more stations, and is there a reason those couldn't be considered for investment?
In the northern part of the corridor, north
Yeah.
of 280,
Yeah.
at this point, what you're reviewing are just ideas that we've come up with to stimulate
Okay.
conversation. So if this is something you'd like us to look at, there's nothing stopping us doing that. My caution for not recommending additional median stations north of 280 is simply right-of-way constraints.
Yeah.
I could see perhaps impacting private land adjacent to the freeway that could be unwelcome by the community.
Do you have a figure of merit for how much time it would take for a bus to get through a corridor station, and another figure of merit in terms of minutes, right? For how long it would take a typical bus to have to weave its way off to the off-ramp, get through the off-ramp, do whatever it's going to do to load and unload at such stations and get back on again. I'm guessing there's a huge time penalty to do the latter.
High-level estimate would think a few minutes difference.
Yeah.
First station.
So guys,
First
I
station.
think we're getting down too much into stations, and I know it's an important idea, but if we can just figure out how we're going to design the roadway, let's focus on that part, because that's going to be more important than the stations will come along as we finish it up.
I think it'll be good.
So,
Anyway, I guess, yeah, I was, for another question, I was intrigued with your comment that you're trying to solicit partnerships with private employers to get them to help us pay for all of this. And wanted to know if you'd gotten any traction on that. I know in past meetings we talked about soliciting data from them as to their ridership, and they're, on the one hand, publicly in the newspaper saying, oh, of course we want to help, and then privately providing us nothing. Have we made any further headway on any of these initiatives with private employers?
We have had conversations with some of the major TMAs, Moffett Park area,
Okay.
Stanford Research Park area. They're aware that the financial pressures we're under are leading us in this direction, and
Yeah.
they've expressed an interest in exploring whether this model makes sense for them. We don't yet have a commitment from them. We
Yeah.
haven't identified what their share would be if they were to join us on something like this, nor have we made any determinations about what the specific routing would be. So all things that, if the board approves this idea on May 2nd, we'll begin working on immediately in anticipation of making this change early in 2020, which would be when the express passes that employers buy for their employees are set to renew.
So this concept is, if I'm getting it correctly, so you can confirm or tell me where I got this wrong, we need help running public bus service in public corridors. Not all those corridors are necessarily built yet. We absolutely can't afford to subsidize this, to continue to subsidize this out of our own funds. Could you help either with capital improvements and or operating expense for us to move the rest of the public in these corridors?
So let me-
Finding some advantage in if we make these capital investments, they would inure to the benefit of your private shuttles as well. Is that
What
I'm-
Adam is referring to is the
Yeah.
express bus plan that we're talking about with partnering with private employers. And what the number that Adam quoted at the beginning.
just to do operating work?
Yeah. So what Adam
Okay.
quoted at the beginning was $10 million. That carries about 700 individuals a year. So
Yeah.
there's 700 people we carry for $10 million. What we hear all the time is if you only ran a bus here, we would fill it up. I promise you we'd fill it up.
Right. And
Those
you don't.
promises have never come true.
Yep.
So what the strategy is that if you're really serious about it, we'll partner with you. And we have some minimum criteria that we're looking at, a minimum financial contribution to run express buses in whatever route makes sense. But if there's no takers on that, then we don't operate the service. And that's the plan that Adam's talking about.
So these are
What you're
companies,
talking about
companies
is a
typically
larger-
coming to you saying, couldn't you just run this service for us? We don't want to.
Companies have not said that to us.
It's individuals,
Well,
employees at
yes,
companies.
It's individuals and it's elected officials and a range of other people who have said, please run a bus. I promise you it'll be full.
Okay.
And we run a bus and it's not full. In fact,
Right.
it's very, very poorly utilized for the most part.
Yeah.
So what Adam is talking about is that. But what we're talking about in the context of this is it could be a range of different operating scenarios that we would run in a rubber tire to manage lane system. You know, LA is doing this right now where they've got 5+, and basically what's happening there is they're charging corporate shuttles to run in the express lanes, the managed lanes. So
What do they charge typically for a bus?
I don't know.
We'd have to find out.
But I'm sure it's enough to make it attractive for them to do it. And they've made the recommendation. I mean, that was not politically a really easy thing to do, because you know, if you're HOV2 or HOV3, you're paying to get into that lane, right? You're not riding for free. So
Right.
that's one model, and there's many permutations you can think of about what might be operated under such models for us. So there might be a model where there's private shuttles. There's even maybe school buses running that are paying a fee. You know, there's you know, public bus services, and you know, maybe Greyhound is paying a fee to run in the lane. Who knows? We're going to look at all that stuff. But the thing is to get the facility there that's managed in such a way that you know, you have a benefit to operate in there. And right now we're required by law for the express lanes in Santa Clara County to maintain a minimum speed of 45 miles an hour. And that's the target we're shooting for. We're talking about these systems. We want to maintain a optimal operating speed right in the sweet spot of that curve that Adam showed, so that everybody that's in the lane benefits from that.
Right. Thank you.
Susan?
Do you have a magnitude, a scale, and cost on these different alternatives?
We don't at this point. We're so early in the process that we haven't come up with any cost numbers. What I could estimate, though, is that median stations are probably going to cost around $25 million each, using a number from San Diego when they built freeway median stations that are, you know, have the facilities to transfer from the freeway level down to the street level or up to the street level.
And what about the lane improvements to the lane, the striping, whatever it needs to take to actually get the new transit lanes?
I don't have a number as of yet for that. This is something we'd figure out in the next phase of our analysis, which is the alternatives analysis that we present back to you, hopefully by the end of the year, as a matrix comparing costs for everything.
And what about the park and ride? Some of the, like especially in the Campbell area, there's actually no room to have any kind of park and ride or staging or anything like that. Has that been considered yet in these stations?
That is a good question for our discussion later today.
Okay.
Recognizing that the benefit of expanding the travel shed by providing parking around the station is going to come at the cost of perhaps an existing land use or the need to acquire land. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the right fit for a certain community.
Okay, thank you.
Johnny?
Thank you for the presentation. I like Susan, have a question as to costs. We know we have $385 million from taxpayer dollars to deal with. I remember our last study to pave a lane between 87 and 280 was $170 million when we came out, 3-4 years ago on that. But that doesn't extend all the way to 101.
That number was the estimate to build the additional lane, express lane, and install the tolling infrastructure for that lane.
Right. Okay. So I don't know if we're taking ideas on what I would like to see.
Yeah, let's hear it.
But the reason why we went to the tax.
Johnny?
Yes.
We're going to have questions, so if you have a comment or...
Okay. Well, that's why I asked if.
But
I guess I'll save my question. I mean, I'll ask the question. For me, more stops doesn't necessarily mean more people will get on. We have, just in my experience, the more stops you have, the slower speed the bus is going to go, and therefore it's not as competitive as just getting in your car. So I think we have to weigh weigh that. I prefer the 7 or 10 stop. 7 would be better, I think, even as long as they're major things, like they were talking about, major stops. So I guess I'll save my comments to the time that you want me to, I guess. Huh?
Thank you.
Ms. Bruins?
Okay, so just so I can kind of get my head wrapped around this, you've got these 3 models that have, 7, 10, or 14 stations. So go to the 7. What is the average, just roughly, distance between those?
Our corridor is about 24 miles long. We're not going all the way to the end, so I'd estimate 7 over 21 miles, 3 miles each.
Okay. And then if we were to, if we're looking at trying to move people and trying to do it in an efficient mode, it seems to me that at the center of a lot of this design work has to be understanding where the job centers are that come off of this corridor, or where this corridor is actually being used. If I live in South County and I work at Kaiser, I'm probably taking 85 up, to get to the Homestead facility, right? But have you put anything together that kind of shows us where the heat map is for major job centers? And the reason I ask this is because when we look at what the high-tech companies have done, what makes them, one, able to do what they did so expeditiously, and then to sustain it, is it's not about where people live. It's all knowing that they're all coming to, this campus, this campus, this campus, and then I just go and figure out where my collection points are. And they're moving the largest number of people, kind of thinking about where the job center, where their own private job centers are. So if we took that same approach, what would the heat map look like along this corridor in terms of this? Because, as members up here, we kind of talk about, oh, DeAnsel's a great one, and we talk about North Bayshore, but what is all along the corridor? And so I would love to be able to see that. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, or...
We touched on this a little bit with the travel market analysis at a previous meeting.
Right.
The hotspots are, of course, the north of Bayshore area, the DeAnza College area, and then there's a pocket of commercial uses along Highway 85 near Almaden that are the big hotspots for driving employment, the destination end of the trip.
So we don't think 85 is being used. For example, I just pulled Kaiser out of the air, thanks to Howard over here.
Kaiser's right next to Apple.
But if you look at Apple and you look at Kaiser, do they get factored into this at all?
It's a little bit tricky because most of the data we're using is based on automobile trips, where the routing of those trips is not necessarily the most direct, it's the fastest. So it's hard to know how many folks are peeling off of the road and deviating to Apple. Intuitively, we know that it's a major destination.
Okay, and then in looking at this, so in terms of station locations, had staff even done a cursory look at this in terms of looking at them in terms of their attributes? Because in terms of whether they would lend themselves to more of a quick and efficient type of station location versus something that is going to be like the gnarly kind of thing. So did you factor any of the existing attributes or potentials along the way?
We haven't thought to the level of the specifics of the station design, more about what the surrounding land uses are and transit connections.
Okay. And then my last question is, when we look at this, the next phase is doing this deeper dive in terms of the alternatives analysis, right? So in the ideal scenario, I think about El Camino Real, and I think we had 7 alternatives.
We did.
What is kind of the goal? You kind of have 4 laid out here. Is 4 about the right number, given that we've kind of put a constraint on trying to get this thing completed by the end of the year?
4 would be a great number, and then maybe 2, max 3 operating scenarios for each.
Okay. Because I mean, I think it will help us when we have our discussion to understand
Can
what
I
our-
just add a little bit of clarity to what Jeannie was asking? So, when you look around at what's done today, you look at bus operations that are happening in freeway medians and how they interact with the surrounding community. The key thing, you either get the people to the stations in the median, or the buses go off and they serve an off-street location. And we see both models functioning, sometimes even in the same corridor. When you look at I-15 in San Diego, and some of the employment areas that are around there, there's some, it's pretty spread out. And so what some of the private employers have done, they've pooled together and they operate shuttles that connect to the stations in the median. And they run shuttles to the median. And so the express buses come in, they stop at that station, but then private partners pay for shuttles that serve those stations. The buses that are run by MTS deviate and go off. And they generally go off pretty far, and some of them don't even come back on and keep going up. That's the end of their route.
Right.
You come down. So there's just the beauty of what we're sort of talking about here with the rubber tire operations, that you can think of very flexible operating plans that you can almost tailor make to what you see the demand is. So when we get into more of a detailed demand analysis, some of the information we find from that will help us define what we want to do in the corridor, whether we want to have center median stations, where we want to have them deviate off, where we want to have off-street transit centers, like it's being talked about at De Anza College. Those things will become more apparent once we get a little bit more into the data.
Yep. Thank you. That helps.
Mason?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. I'm here in behalf of Mayor Klein, who wishes he could be here. For the fee for private buses, when you look at Seattle or LA, do you have a comparable fee? I know that this is master planning, but I'm just curious about kind of the fee that's charged to those private companies.
I don't have a number for a per shuttle bus fee. I know that in Seattle, a potential use of the single occupant vehicle fees that they catch in their express lane can go back to supporting transit use in the corridor, but the legislature has currently not allowed that. It may change in the future. That could be an applicable strategy for this corridor for the alternative that allows single occupant vehicles to use the corridor. When we think about our future express program and partnering with these employers, we probably wouldn't think about a per vehicle fee, but rather we would want to hit a certain target of fare box recovery. So we wouldn't want to pay 97% like we're doing now. We might want to pay a number a good deal lower than that. So it would be more of a partnership rather than a per vehicle number.
Understood. And when you outreach to the private market and our business community, what alternative do they prefer? Is it mixed? Is it mixed response? Or is it they all tend towards the fast travel or the maximum person?
Today is the first time that anybody has seen these outside of VTA.
I see.
So we're not yet to that step. I'd love to receive private input, though, as we go along in this process.
Okay, because that would be very helpful to any elected official trying to make a decision. Because I think, personally, I think a lot of the market is going to depend on a lot of my personal opinion on this is going to depend on what the market bears.
Mm-hmm. And the express bus study that Chris mentioned earlier is going to be looking at those questions to see what kind of partnership opportunities exist and to what extent.
Okay, thank you. And then for the first mile, last mile, I don't think you're going to have an issue as long as you embed bicycle and electric assist, shared micromobility into that. People will be using electric scooters, electric bikes. You see that in LA. I was just there a week ago, and I saw how great the transit was, despite other problems. I agree with Councilmember Sinks about North Bayshore, although I understand why your study is the way it is in terms of the 24 miles. For the cost
Mason,
per alternative,
Do you have questions or comments at this time? Because
I
I want
I've
to get the staff, so if they have questions too.
understood. I've been asking many questions, Chair. And so another question is, what is the cost per alternative?
We have not refined that at this point. I anticipated that we would make a lot of adjustments today, so once we start to settle on certain designs, we could get into the specifics of the cost, and we probably won't have a precise number until we release the final alternatives analysis, which would be later this year, we hope.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, we'll allow city staff to, if they have questions, either at the dais or sitting background. Does
Yeah.
anybody from the cities have questions? Okay, I see the first hand over here. Could you come up and let us know what city you're with?
I'm Josephine Kimura with City of San Jose. I'm representing
Could you come to the microphone because we are being broadcast, or live streamed, or recorded?
Hi, I'm Josephine Kimura. I'm with the City of San Jose, representing DOT. Just a quick question. You were talking about bypass lanes. Were those bypass lanes just around the stations, or so it's just an extra lane right around the stations? Is that correct? Okay. And then in terms of goals for city comments, I mean, there's not too many city staff here today, but I think a lot of people back at the office would like an opportunity to provide comments. Is there going to be kind of a forum for that, or kind of a venue for me to take back, these alternatives and show, the planning group and stuff, and for them to submit comments to you, or who should they send them to?
Yes.
Okay.
Take them back. We're happy to accept comments from DOT and San Jose Planning. Absolutely.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yes?
Hello, my name is Piu Ghosh, and I'm with the City of Cupertino's Planning Department. One of the things that I noticed in the alternatives was, freeway on and off-ramp stations in the southern portion of the corridor. However, these are not being considered in the northern section where there are no medians. There's no right-of-way for median stations, but it might be possible for the that new lane that's going to be constructed to kind of go up to possibly the El Camino, where there are employment centers for on and off-ramp stations in that particular area. But that was just a suggestion more than a question. So, thank you.
Anybody from this side? Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Shahid Abbas, Transportation and Traffic Manager for the City of Sunnyvale. I have a couple of suggestions or comments, It's a little technical. I'll try to be as simple as possible. Generally, a lane on a freeway, we should operate at 25 to 2700 vehicles per hour per lane. That's the capacity of a highway. Here, I think we are operating less than 2000. That's not the optimal capacity which are we utilizing an SR 85. So there is something is missing. So we need to understand why we are not achieving the optimum. You said there's a bell-shaped curve. Horizontal, vertical is the speed. Horizontal is the capacity. So if we are on the below of the bell, let's say we can still have the speed 40 miles per hour, 25 miles are being below on the bell, on the belly of the bell, and we can still have the same speed. If our system is operating on the lower side of the bell, then it cannot be attributed directly to the capacity on the freeway. There are other issues which are causing to lower the capacity on the freeway. So we need to find and address those issues. Otherwise, I can add a couple of lanes, I can add the transit lanes. The overall impact of origin to destination, we're not going to achieve that impact unless we address the underlying causes. And those can be a host of different issues or frictions which the freeway is receiving but not attributed directly to the capacity of the freeway itself. For example, your service streets are not capable of handling the traffic when they transit from freeway onto. And if you drive on 101 and 237, you can observe where the traffic is congested. Only when those interchanges comes. And I can give you a lot of examples. LA has been taken as a role model time and again. I've been to LA a lot. I go there after every other week. I have 3 kids live in LA, downtown, Los Feliz, West Hollywood, so I drive those corridors a peak. Trust me, I don't think so. By doing those managed lane, they have make a big dent into the operation of their freeways. 101, Highway 10. It's the problem, again, is the capacity. The capacity is not attributed to the freeway operation, it is attributed to the other elements which has not been addressed, or they don't have the capacity to address that. My other point is, the good thing here is SR85 has a very directional traffic, peak hour. I think that's a very good thing. Let's say we have 6 lanes and I have a direction traffic. Why should we not consider a reversible lane? Which is, we don't have to increase the footprint of our highway, and still we have a lot of capacity and the flexibility. I give you an example. Commonwealth of Virginia, there from where I came back, 95 is the most congested corridor in the nation. And they converted that 95 into reversible lanes, and our delay timing there reduced down by 40% just by converting them into a reversible lane. Other thing which is very important to reduce the capacity onto the surface streets, that's very important. Until unless we don't increase the capacity on the surface street, we're not going to solve much of the problem. Park and ride. I can go back and park at interchange and then take a shuttle. Instead of riding 100 cars going through the interchange, no, I have one bus and one shuttle. So I have increased the capacity of my surface street a lot. In Michigan, nobody can build an interchange until unless they have a park and ride. Every interchange have a park and ride. And same policy is now being followed in Commonwealth of Virginia and Florida and many other states. I think that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you could just write some notes and give it to us, that would be appreciated too. Okay, anybody else? Anybody at the Mountain View? Quiet? Sunnyvale? Cupertino?
I have one quick additional question.
Oh.
My name is Chris Grohl. I'm with the City of Cupertino.
Oh.
I was wondering for the portion of 85, the space constrained portion between 280 and 101, whether or not a reversible lane had been given consideration.
Yes. Go ahead.
Expected this question to come up.
They got film.
We did consider that. The challenge with the reversible lane is ideally you would like it to be right in the middle of the street, or the roadway, so that you can minimize the right-of-way needs you have. But that's also where we've located all of the pillars that support all of our overpasses in the narrow places. So there would be an extensive cost to reconstruct those overpasses that we felt was cost prohibitive. We can always explore that kind of idea, of course, but just it didn't make it into our initial alternatives for that reason.
Okay. Roger?
So I do have a question. In the beginning, you discussed that the train through this alignment was, I believe you said it was just cost prohibitive or it just didn't pencil out. Maybe get into some of that more specifically if you would. And then,
Sure.
Because you have locations here from 280 to 87 where you've got 4 HOV 2+ lanes with B and 2 bus only lanes, and how that would look if it was just, say, a couple trains.
Sure. We looked at this quite a bit at a previous policy advisory board meeting, and the challenge with light rail is that it is the right choice when you have a high level of demand for the corridor, where you can operate frequent service and where you can operate high capacity service, which would be multi-car trains. We contrasted what VTA does with what Boston does, where for our infrastructure, we don't operate that many train hours per mile of track that we have. Boston does the opposite. They have quite a bit of hours. So they're getting a lot of public benefit per the maintenance and operations cost that comes with maintaining the infrastructure that we don't get here. So we have a much higher cost per passenger, around $8 per passenger on light rail than Boston does, which is around $2. And in looking at the land uses along this corridor and looking at the directional travel pattern, which is not ideal for transit since you want to take folks out and bring them back on the same trip, we did not think we could support a level of transit service that would make the math for light rail work.
Is it also tied into, this is really just commuter traffic, or as if it was users were using this for other than to get to and from work, that would play into it?
Commuter traffic is our strongest market, so that's what we would likely aim our service toward. Of course, we can discuss what our operations plan is today, but we thought that if you can travel along the corridor at 65 miles per hour in off-peak direction and off-peak times of day, it would make light rail not very time competitive compared to other options people are using along the corridor.
And you would just go into that knowing that you would just operate, through certain hours of the morning and certain hours in the afternoon to time with the commute hours, correct?
Sure, but that rail infrastructure would be out there permanently and carry with it a very high operating cost per quantity of service that we operate on it.
And a very high capital cost.
That's
much
also
higher
true.
than any of the trails we're talking about right now. I mean, right now, it's probably 250 to 350 million a mile to build light rail.
And
So you're talking about several $1 billion to build light rail through that corridor.
And that's even if you had fewer stations and just focused on speed in the beginning, and maybe other stations came in later.
Say that again? Build
Well,
less?
Well, have less stations. Have it more just to get from the south to the north to where Caltrain is, and not have quite as many stations to begin with.
Well, it's not so much the number of stations related to the cost, it's the structure and all the other ancillary things that go in with building light rail, the catenary, so on and so forth. So even if you did fewer stations, you'd obviously have fewer ridership, but that's not going to improve the performance of the project very much.
All right.
City of Mountain View, Don.
Thank you. I do appreciate that most of my questions have already been asked by the PAB members. I do wonder, was there something particular about Middlefield that was drawing you to show that as a station location when you consider connecting to Caltrain, North Bay Shore, even the city plans in that area?
When we did video counts along the corridor, we recorded significantly different volumes of private shuttles in the southern portion of the corridor, about 15 to 20 per hour, compared to areas around El Camino northward, which were about 30-some per hour, if I recall. So we felt that there was a higher demand for transit or for shuttles in that area, and so providing another station in that area closer to some of the employment uses could make sense. But this is a staff brainstorming, not necessarily a final decision.
Okay, so I'll ask my questions and then we'll go into comments. We're also going to be building for the future, and so autonomous vehicles, is that going to be one of our considerations of when we build this particular transit?
I think it is a good thought to keep in mind that this lane is really a guideway that can be used as we best deem fit. When you think about rail as a use, you really lock yourself into a particular technology. And the PAB talked at our last meeting about thinking about how to be innovative in this corridor and perhaps how to be adaptable as new technology comes along. So thinking about designs that don't preclude future technologies may be worth considering here. To the extent that autonomous vehicles become a reality and become widely used, perhaps the rules on this lane could be changed, or perhaps technology could be used to closely space those vehicles for even improving throughput over what we see when humans drive vehicles.
Okay. So you were showing this concept of stations, but isn't it more likely that we could be using buses originating somewhere else and just connecting onto our transit lane, and so we're not looking at one bus is going to make all these multiple stops?
Oh, certainly. I could imagine a bus going down Stevens Creek, joining the corridor midway. That's the real convenience you get with the rubber tire situation, is that you have that flexibility in routing.
Okay. On slide 28, if space is limited, why would you present all these options? I mean, if you say, well, that's a lot of roadway in there, so why are you even suggesting that?
I've been intentionally broad in coming up with these ideas.
Okay.
One of the things that I really want to make sure in this analysis is that we make our work we avoid future criticism by not considering some idea, or by avoiding not considering certain ideas. I wouldn't want to be years down the line, nearing construction, and someone derails the process by saying, you didn't think of this. So some ideas we may very much like as a group, some ideas we may not like, but I'd like to have the analysis done, the data out there, so we can show why a certain alternative wasn't pursued and justify the ones we do.
Okay. You made a mention that 90% of the VTA riders walk to their station, but is that basically on the short haul? But what about on the long haul? I mean, to find, what did you say, 90%? Because I don't see, go ahead.
A service like this, that's long and fast, is probably more akin to something on the Caltrain end of the spectrum than it is a local bus end of the spectrum. So a person's willingness to put up with inconvenience is going to be proportional to the benefit they get from the service. Caltrain, very fast travel, comfortable ride, low stress, no traffic congestion. That's a big benefit. And so folks are likely willing to travel farther to get to that type of service. A city bus going 11 miles per hour probably doesn't carry the same appeal. So perhaps that 90% number we revise for a service like this, if you want to expand your walk shed, you could likely draw people from farther away willing to use it if they see it as giving them a big advantage.
So in a sense, you're saying our model should be more like Caltrain. Less stops, just moving right along.
Let's nudge ourselves in that direction along the
Like a
spectrum.
baby boat. Okay.
Have express mean something.
Slide 23. So is that the current level right now where the bubble for SR85 is? Is that the current?
We're seeing about 4,500 to 5,000 vehicles per hour, or total in the corridor, which puts us in a range of around 1,500 per lane during peak periods per Caltrans data. So I would estimate that we are around that bubble. That also corresponds with the travel speeds that we've observed using our mobile device location data through our INRIX data.
And so are you saying that we could triple it if we get a transit solution?
If you can get the speed faster and you can get more people per vehicles, you can increase the person throughput of the lane.
Okay. And okay, and so you mentioned $5 million, so that's what VTA is committed to the Express Lane program?
The Express Bus program.
For?
Annually.
Annually.
So we're currently at 10. The proposal is to go down to 5 being VTA's contribution, hoping that private employers can be the partner to help fill in the other need.
Okay. And can we bring up the slide or my video? Would this be appropriate time?
Sure.
Is this a question?
To the
Yes.
chair's discretion.
Well, the answer is either yes or no. It didn't say do it.
Yeah. I want to see if, well, my idea of a reversible bus lane is the same.
I don't know how to do that from here.
Okay, well then we'll go. I won't slow us up. Okay, so no further questions. I'll let Mr. Chamis, you want to start off with your comments, please?
Thank you, Chair. If it were up to me, I know it's not, but I would take the higher throughput option and maybe even go down to the 7 stops instead of the 10 stops to see if we can minimize cost. I know that each station is $25 million, $25 million, and we only have $385 million to deal with. After all this discussion, I did have some questions about, somebody made a great observation that sometimes it's what slows down traffic is interchanges and things like that. I know that money's being spent on interchanges, especially Highway 280, 85 interchange with Foothill Expressway. Is that am I correct in that assumption?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we are doing something about the exit points. Any other interchanges that are being improved?
There are several around the county. I couldn't tell you.
I mean, along the 85 corridor.
Not that I know of.
237 has got something going.
Well, 237's got the express lanes project going on.
Yeah, no, I only care about the 85 corridor. Okay.
No, we're 85 and 237.
Oh, I see,
come
I see.
Together.
Yeah,
Is
okay.
Is
All right. Well, my suggestion is, we maximize. So I guess it's the third scenario. What number is it?
Maximize person throughput.
Maximize throughput. Alternative. And if we want to, and I agree with the possibility of getting stops, somewhere else. You can have the same point, have a bus go all the way down to Morgan Hill and pick up people too. I think that would be another alternative as well. But I mean, if we're talking about this corridor, I think speed is better than number of stations, because the more it becomes a viable alternative to a vehicle, the more ridership will come. This is what we've been talking about for years at VTA, and I'm hoping that we follow through on that. So I'm okay with seven stations along the corridor, and we could put some north and south of the corridor too. But that would be my suggestion. That's all I had, Chair.
But you could also go for less stations then too.
Well,
Super stations.
whatever is feasible. I think 7 is, the way you had it laid out, I think it's a good, the 7 are pretty good, pretty good areas to stop. Cottle has a hospital. I don't know about Meridian necessarily, but Almaden might be a better one. Almaden has anyway, I don't know. Some of the ones on here are pretty decent places to stop.
Okay.
So I'm not.
Okay, we'll leave
I'm
it.
okay with 10 and I'm okay with 7, but I think
Speed
if
is
we want to
important.
minimize cost, we go with 7.
Thank you.
Could I ask Member Camus a question?
Sure.
If people are coming from the South County and they want to come up this corridor, where would that connection be? Or maybe it's a question of staff. I'm asking you because you're the expert down.
Well, a lot of people just go on Highway 85 from South County all the way from Morgan Hill and Gilroy. I talked to.
Well, let's say that they were going to entertain connecting to a public transit service that we use, where would that logical connection point be?
Cottle has
Cottle, okay.
park and ride. It also has a light rail station, and it has a lot of other. Actually, it also has a Caltrain station. So there's already 3 modes of transportation.
Cottle is a Caltrain station?
One more time?
Cottle is a Caltrain station?
It's near. I said it's near a Caltrain station. It has light rail, and it has park and ride, and it also has access to Highway 101 and it obviously 85.
Okay.
Well, you want to continue with your comments? Yeah, would you?
Sure. Yeah, I am interested in effective connection to South County for those folks that have to come up. I mean, honestly, where I've been for now years, having lobbied successfully for the $350 million of funding in Measure B 2016, is to see if we couldn't do something for everybody commuting up this corridor. And we know that large employers can afford their employees comfortable bus service. They see it as amenity, and I think they also see it as a competitive advantage over folks who work in mid and small-sized tech companies. And there's a huge market, I think, out there if we were properly organized and we offered a big enough service. Now, I'm sounding like those folks that aren't riding the bus, but I think there are a few things that we haven't done very well. The 185, quite frankly, that we're discontinuing, I think, is a joke, right? It stops at the Caltrain station in Gilroy, stops in the Caltrain station in Morgan Hill, goes all the way up to Mountain View, bypassing the housing-rich area which Johnny represents in South San Jose. We need a service for the rest of us, and we need to figure out how to get it subsidized by folks who take advantage of our public infrastructure but really aren't paying their fair share today. And I think it's vital that we sort this out, that we make some deals to cover some of the capital costs of this to the extent we can't get the money out of Measure B immediately or never, and also for the operating expense. Our sustainability manager sent out an email this morning. Now, this is anecdotal, and I realize these aren't statistics, but they're real people who are leaving our area. Her husband is a teacher. They live in South San Jose. One of her big frustrations, she can't stand right, to commute from where she can afford to live. This is a big dilemma for us. If we can't move people around our own county efficiently, we really are failing to be the transit agency we need. Now, I do not expect, I'm happy with the 90-10 plan in general, meaning I think VTA ought to be focusing on these major corridors and do the work that only a regional agency can do. I don't think that VTA ought to be trying to do what the city of Cupertino is contemplating doing and running a shuttle bus all over the city and on-demand service. It really has to, I think, focus on core service in these corridors. But if we can't even manage to do that, then I think cities like mine are going to raise their own taxes and fees, and we're going to do it. So while I agree on the fast travel speed alternative, fewer stations, but I do think we need to make sure that people can get on and off these conveyances so that things are time efficient. If we have to get off on the majority of these places, you know, and spend 5 to 10 minutes dinking around to load, unload, and then get back on again, I think, you know, we're not going to provide a great service. So I think there do need to be a small selected number of stations on the corridor that effectively link passengers in the South County who might like to use this. I don't know, where is the Caltrain station down there? Is it at Cottle or?
Along Monterey alignment.
Well, I'd be interested in seeing about, you know, getting people up on Caltrain that would come to, say, my city efficiently. Because right now, my understanding is people ride all the way up to Sunnyvale or Mountain View and then they come down, right? I think that would be a benefit. Our surface streets are being inundated. We know a lot of people are going up to, as I said before, North Sunnyvale and well, I'll add Sunnyvale, North Sunnyvale and North Mountain View. We've just got to make it possible for people in these medium and small-sized companies to have an alternative. And, you know, if it takes taxing the folks that are using or laying fees or incentives otherwise on major employers who are running these shuttles today, that's what I'd like to see done. And then, yes, efficient stations where we have them, rather than stations that go forever. And I'm not trying to predispose whether they ought to be in the center or whether we're trying to run things on shuttles and then have an extra, say, lane on the off-ramp to do it well. I'm not sure what the right answer is. But I do know, you know, for the major transit market that is De Anza College today, right? And that is a nexus for things going on, and one of the nexuses for things going on in my city. I would like that to be an efficient point to get on and off without ensnarling the service we'd like to run. So those are my thoughts. I mean, I have to say, when we started this a few years ago, I was very hopeful, talking to the likes of Ron Duradon, that, you know, we could still make light rail a possibility. So I appreciate comments on light rail. I've come to believe that the VTA in its current form and shape, basically, extending light rail service anywhere in the county hardly makes any sense. This corridor, I guess, included. So we're going to have to get more creative. I'm open to transit alternatives that don't look like cars and buses, if we can find something innovative. So Jeannie and I have been spending some time thinking about that. But fundamentally, you know, it's got to be, I think it's got to be a system that by hook, crook, fee, service, or incentive, we can lure our major employers into seeing benefit from, so they can help us move everybody else. And if we can't do that, my interest in this project to just move more cars is about zip. I'd like to see us really change the game on getting people into transit with high occupancy vehicles. So I like your HOV 5+. I like limited stations. I like making this an attractive alternative to just getting in your car. And I think autonomous vehicles, city shuttles, on-demand services can complement the core service that I'd like to see VTA provide in our major corridors, including 85. Thanks.
I'd also like to bring attention, we forgot about it a bit, but staff is also asking about compatibility with city plans, city goals, or impacts. So if you have any comments along that line, Johnny, if you wanted to think about it.
I'll just say that on that line, I do think, right, cities ought to be working on land use to increase density at these nexus points. And, you know, if we think park and ride's important, or at least a drop-off point for, you know, ride sharing and shuttle sharing services, I think we as cities ought to be working on that, give it a, you know, limited funding otherwise.
Okay. Susan?
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Sir?
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Since I agree with everybody here, I'd like to propose the zero station solution. No, I'm actually really serious. Why are corporate shuttles successful? And why do we all in this room view transit as the other guy's thing to ride so they're not in our city? We got all the traffic data. We know that there's 6,000 people that actually go from the way south of 85 to the way north of 85. And we know that there's 100,000 cars that cross Saratoga. So the vast majority of people are not going the whole length of this corridor, despite the way our brains seem to want to internalize the problem. We got the on-ramp, off-ramp data so we can see who's going to which on-ramp and off-ramps. So we know how people are actually commuting on the corridor. We didn't actually get to which job center they're going to, but I believe the corporate shuttles are successful because they take you to an employment center. Jeannie talked about this a little bit. And I think that building a network based on our old model of intersecting transit options, where people who have a choice to be in a car today can now go walk 10 minutes, wait for a high-speed bus or train, whatever it is, get on that high-speed thing, zip up the corridor. Let's say we got up to like 500 miles an hour, Rod. They got right to De Anza, they hop off, then they walk 10 minutes to another bus so that then they can then go down Stevens Creek so that they can get to their job, when they could just get in their car and just drive. That's what we're competing against. And so I think that single seat solutions or near single seat solutions are why the corporate shuttles are super successful. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of our stuff is not that successful. And I worry a lot that the model that we're advocating here is stops in the corridor that connect to other transit services, because each one of those stops is not necessarily how long you wait for everybody else to get on and off. It's what are you going to do when you get off and have to sync up with another bus or walk to another station. So I'm wondering if the model should not be a super high-speed corridor with virtually no stations that connect to some big spots. Cottle is a big one with the park and ride and everything there. Across the way is the Blossom Hill Caltrain station, right? I get that corridor. I get De Anza as a key point. But I also think if you look at the map, a lot of people get off and they get on 280, or they get off and they go down 237. So shouldn't we not build a high-speed corridor, and then in that high-speed corridor layer some buses that start in some sort of collection area, and again, we know where people are getting on the freeways, and then actually end at employment centers. So I'm going to make a couple of ones that sound goofy, but I'm not a transportation planner, right? I mean, maybe there is a bus that goes from south and it gets off at De Anza or Stevens Creek, or goes down 280 and does some sort of grand loop that does Apple and Kaiser and Stevens Creek back up, or De Anza and the other way around. And that's its whole route. It doesn't go all the way on to North Bayshore. But you have another one that goes from that same general location that goes all the way, and it goes past De Anza and goes up and does some sort of loop in North Bayshore. I think we need to be building a corridor that's fast, and we need to be getting people close to where they need to be. Having something that's monotonic and goes up and down the corridor, and we call it the 85 bus route, and putting 7 stations on or 10 stations on so that they can then connect to other transit, pretty much means it's going to be limited to the transit-dependent riders or the very marginal car ownership riders. And we want to actually move the needle. We want to get people to see the fast way to work is via transit.
So if I got this, Howard, you would have fewer than 7 stations, but you would have some.
Yeah, and again, in the corridor, I think is wrong. Like, I'll pick on De Anza a little bit, right? If you put one right in the middle, and even if you went up and over or whatever, I think that is less desirable than some sort of transit center off to the, and I don't know west from north from, but the more southeast side of 85, the De Anza side of 85, because that's where people are trying to go. Putting them 200 yards in the middle of something that maybe they take an elevator, or I mean, however it goes, just moves them that much farther away from where they want to go. And every single one of those impediments, every single seat change and every single step they have to make reduces the likelihood. So I think we should go with the minimum number of stations. We should plan for bus routes that have a high-speed component on the backbone and a low-speed sort of local loopy kind of thing. And I don't know how big they are, but we got to get people near to where they're working. And I see Apple Kaiser, Stevens Creek, Valco is kind of a nexus. I see De Anza is kind of a nexus. I see North Bayshore. I see some Sunnyvale areas as nexus. What I don't see is this being a viable system with 7 stops or 10 stops and a bus that just goes back and forth on 85, and the expectation is that people are going to get onto it and then get on some other local shuttle, whatever. Too many seat changes means no riders. So that's why it's an honest proposal. 0 may not be the right answer, but the number should be as small as it can be, and the expectation is not that the buses are constrained to the corridor, but they take advantage of that speed while they're there, and then they use the local loop thing to get people to actually where they want to go. The other half to this, I think, is even more important. I think for every bus that we would be willing to put out there, I'll bet you that the private parties would be willing to put 10 of them out there. Yeah. And I think that serves the goal of moving people in a cost-effective and time-effective manner. I don't care if they're in a VTA bus or a corporate shuttle. If we can make a mass transit solution more desirable than a car solution, we solve a myriad of other issues. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. So I guess it's whatever option, Johnny, did you say? The fastest option, the fewest number of stations, and my only spin on it is that we need to consider routes that are not constrained to the corridor.
Any of these comments?
Oh, in terms of compatibility with city plans, I didn't even bring it up. We have a transit center in Saratoga, and we'd love to get all corporate shuttles and everything to coalesce on that transit center, but it's a mile off of the corridor, and it's impossible to get to, and I wouldn't wish that on VTA riders in general. But my corporate shuttles, it is our goal that all corporate shuttles will originate and terminate at West Valley College Transit Center, and they would then drive through that bad traffic and use this corridor.
Susan?
Thank you. I really support what Howard just said about local loops. If you look at Meridian, there's no connection right now. You cannot get off Highway 85 at Meridian right now. And everything around there, there's no big businesses right at, sorry, I'm going to turn my map back on right now. It's all housing. So there's no place for a park and ride. Again, what physical improvements is going to take to have a on and off there when there is no on and off right now? To get on and off at Bascom, that whole thing is just a giant cluster of on-ramp, off-ramp, 1785. I mean, Campbell is really impacted by all this. We got the North 40, the Samaritan improvements that are going on. We got our light rail is not even close to there. And so if I'm coming up from Morgan Hill and I want to get on my light rail to then get to Campbell, or if I want to come over Highway 17 and miss all the traffic, I can potentially get on at Winchester at our light rail station and get downtown and go wherever after that. So I really support the idea of these loops. I don't know what our percent population that comes from South County and Santa Cruz, but I know a lot of actually city employees and other people that work in our general area. I find this interesting because I was around long enough to remember when originally Highway 85 was supposed to have a bike lane on each side, and I find that we're not even talking about that. For instance, if you got on a Meridian and you wanted to go over to Bascom, you could use the upper level. Some of them you can actually see where the wall was, and you could see where that potential bike lane could have been. So I guess I've been around a long time. I actually would like to hear what Todd might want to add to this, but this internal loop idea is great. The private buses, we've got Netflix, we've got Barracuda. For every private bus, do they have to subsidize a separate bus, or 3-to-1, 2-to-1, or whatever? So I think less stops. If the only goal is to get people through this area, no Meridian, no Bascom, maybe even no Saratoga. I think you really need to look at how someone is getting there, this last mile, on and off both directions. If it's not a quality situation, if you're sitting in traffic and you got this much room to get your bike, you're not going to want to do that. Also, I remember I used to live off of Snell. I'd have to drive to the light rail station, park under, go up gigantic stairs, go over the freeway, go back downstairs to get onto the train that didn't actually move a whole lot faster than driving, and then I'd get off. I'd have to then walk upstairs, down over and again, and if I'm in the rain, you really think I'm going to do that? If I'm carrying a lot of stuff, I am not going to do that. So some of these are very impractical, thinking that the average person is going to really want to go through all those steps, as Howard was mentioning. I think that's it for right now. I don't know. Todd has any comments about Campbell and the fact that we're not close to our light rail station?
Hello, I'm Todd Capurso from City of Campbell. Yeah, I brought up a comment earlier last week just about when you're looking at potential connections. If you're looking out in the West Valley, Bascom has the added benefit of having probably better access from the freeway in terms of a bus coming on or off. But one thing that maybe we would like you to consider in this analysis is whether or not the Basona extension of the light rail is has a glimmer of becoming a reality, because that might change your analysis and potentially make Winchester a better connection point. Also, but it has working against it is that it's a partial interchange, and if we're going to consider the loop systems where we might want to come off the freeway and then connect with existing transit, there's something to be said for Bascom, there's something to be said for Winchester, but we'd like you to take a look at both of those if you would.
Thank you. Todd is referencing a comment he made to me in email last week. I'll note that we only have about 5 minutes left in our allotted time, and I appreciate the discussion we've had today, but hoping to hear a lot more from city staff. It probably makes sense to do a little bit of refinement based on the direction we've heard today, and then reconnect with city staff on a lot of these local impact questions in the coming weeks.
Ladies first.
So I was just going to make a couple of quick comments. One is I think there's more work that I would personally appreciate coming from city staff people. So I'm going to do this. First of all, I think the 4 alternatives that you have here are the right framework for moving into this next phase. So I would like to support that. The next thing is, in terms of number of stations and such, I would like to see, before we actually go into the actual analysis, is a little bit more help from the cities in trying to say, if we had to pick the critical few opportunities for a station or a stop or something, where would they be? And having each of the cities along the corridor maybe helping us understand why they might have something that makes sense, or why, you put Meridian on here, and Meridian is kind of a stupid idea. I just made that up, okay? But again, city, to help us understand, because I don't want to model something that doesn't really make sense for us to be spending our time, because by the time we're done doing these models, there's a couple of things that I would also, so I want city's help on identifying the critical few stations or opportunities, and it could be why it makes sense to come off even as a looping. So maybe a station within the period of time, and where you might have something that makes sense from a looping point of view. I think that's the term we've been using. Staff, in terms of your modeling and such, I don't know, we have a pretty sophisticated model, but I really want to make sure that we are understanding a couple of different things. One is, if the state legislation continues on the path that it is, and we are really going to start developing all of this housing, it's really going to put a wrinkle in everything, right? So I just want us to make sure that we're not thinking about things are just the way they are, because we don't know what legislation is going to be coming down the road. And the other thing on the modeling is we need to make sure that we're also, I agree with a lot of my colleagues up here, that this modeling should include not only a VTA vehicle, but also all the shuttles and such, because it may make more sense when you really look at if we're creating an infrastructure. Again, I don't really care who drives the darn bus. If I can achieve my goal of managing the congestion on 85, I'm going to be a happy camper, okay? And then I think one of the things that the four have that I like, even though I'm not surprised Mr. Camus, who's no longer here, is all for more cars. I just, I think we have to do all four of them, because I think we need to look long term. Because yes, we may still have some time where we could expand and do everything with just automobiles, but that's when we expand on that and there's no more space, then we're back dead in the water, and we never, elected people never have the political will to take away. It's better to build something and to try it first. So anyway, those were my comments. And for future, going on these slides, one last thing, is only one of these alternatives, actually only two alternatives, the no project and the maximum access alternative, even speaks about SOV with fee, which which means managed lanes are in both of those. I believe managed lanes are in the other two alternatives as well. And if they're not, maybe that's a whole different discussion, given that it's noon. But I thought managed lanes were
just in the no project and the access alternative.
And it's not in the fast travel alternative?
Correct. That's HOV 5+ only.
Could we make
I
it
guess
so?
Yeah, we can always throw it in. Yeah.
I'm not sure why they're not in there if we're going to be doing something. But again, I will take that one offline. But I think it's a good question. I think we better think about it.
Don't we have consensus here to use a very small number of stations, 7 or less?
Let's finish up with the comments. I'll get there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Very, very quickly. Maximum. I like all components, but not everything in each alternative. So moving all four is great for the VTA board to see. My personal preference is maximum person throughput alternative, adding Winchester. I believe when having worked for Vice Mayor Jones, the Winchester's prime for development. There's a lot of permits going through the city of San Jose at Winchester specifically, so that's a very crucial station. And I agree with Member Bruins that each alternative needs to have another alternative of the SOV with fee, because I think that's really going to create the maximize throughput. So thank you.
I'm going to kind of make one bigger picture concept. We're talking about changing people's behavior and changing things that are currently. We're not necessarily future thinking, as Janine mentioned about these housing bills, about autonomous vehicles. And some of this is the peak hours. Business is still 8 to 5, 9 to 6. Where is that discussion with these businesses? What if you do work till 8 o'clock? What if you do stop later in the morning? And so I don't see all these solutions just necessarily a high-speed lane.
City staff over here. Don, you said you had some comments? Oh, you were going to answer the question?
No, just I'm plan on following up with each city, probably individually, to ask the specific questions about how this fits in with their city plans, tolerance for impacts, that sort of thing. We'll talk about station locations.
You want to hold on? Or, yeah.
I think it'd be most appropriate to go ahead and provide our input directly to VTA staff as is being suggested.
Okay. And then my final comments are we got everybody okay, that I agree with Howard and with Johnny, but yes, to Mr. Sink's point, I think everybody wanted the higher speed. Well, there's consensus, not, but all four would be studied, but the higher alternative, the fastest alternative would be the quickest. I also think that the idea of limited stations, or that we don't really have to really think about stations, because we were talking about that before, last meeting, where origination of the bus would determine the destination that it goes, so that we don't have to tire ourselves to putting in stations. And so if the bus starts down Stevens Creek and goes to North Bay Shore, or to Perry Park, or to Moffett Park, I mean, those are the two we also got to consider, because Moffett Park's getting really developed right now. And so that's going to be a major hub of employment. And when you had stations in Middlefield and El Camino, that's so close to an end destination going north. I don't know how many people are going south, but then if they're going south at opposite hours, I don't think we really need to worry about that capacity. But a station that close, I think, going to Howard's Point, and also my conversations with Apple, that transfers will kill us. So the people want speed and they want minimum transfers, and if you go to Mountain View or that is, to me, not necessarily that was an idea, but in Middlefield or El Camino, there's other available transit solutions for them to get to the last mile, and I don't think that would be necessary.
Well, could I ask how John, how you would get folks from south up to your Caltrain station?
Well, if they're going south, then there was also, they could hit...
They're coming from the south, they want to get to Caltrain, say in the morning, and go up to the
hopefully
city.
Caltrain, how far south? Morgan Hill, Gilroy?
Any place on the 85 corridor, they want to come up to Mountain View, they want to get on Caltrain, they want to ride to San Francisco, say. How would you do that?
We would get them, they could go drive right, go ahead. Staff.
I think that is a question that we would strive to answer as city staff working with VTA staff.
Okay.
I'm looking, personally, as I was thinking about and hearing the comments, there seem to be two items to think about. One is passenger transfer and connections, which does lead to, as you're saying, more than one seat and can decrease ridership.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also think about vehicle connections for these buses and shuttles. And once they leave the 85 corridor, what makes sense in terms of our local street systems that will allow them to get to their end destinations and be able to stay on the same vehicle? And what are our plans, like our AGT plans and other plans that might
Right.
support that?
Good, well, whatever you all come up with, we'll
Could you run the
just
video?
want to get there.
Give me slides of
And to
video.
North Bay.
I went to
Okay.
Boston to get these for you.
You went all the way to Boston?
I went all the way to Boston. Okay, there's one slide there, and this is the Highway 93 going into downtown Boston. And as you can see, there is a single reversible transit lane right in the middle between the two. And it looks similar to what they have in San Francisco at the Golden Gate Bridge. It looks like an accordion. I'm not exactly sure. But if there's another view, I'm in this one lane going into town, but if there's the center lane and off for the further left. And, oops,
Sorry.
I thought there was a video.
Is it further along?
No audio, but video. It was a video, but okay. But okay, well, there was just an example, and it was very efficient that I saw. And in this particular reversible transit lane, all cars were doing, but they must be paying something on it, because on the other side it was dead traffic stop. So
It was fast.
it was fast to use that particular line. So I guess we're going to leave the compatibility with city plans and city goals impact to the cities. But I think the board likes your alternatives, but the fastest, as Ms. Bruins would always say, the fastest, cheapest rubber, something along those lines, is what
I think Ms. Bruin said that.
well, she
That's
said.
okay. Just go.
She said something along those lines. But I agree. So that's, again, no. But going back again, also I'd like to remind everybody that we sort of we discussed light rail, but we've, as a board, said it was not a alternative that we would like to further study, and I believe staff's going to bring it back next time as a action item so that we can have formal action to say the light rail is not one of our alternatives to be studied.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, it's too much, but we like the path that we're on. Did staff get enough information to bring us something back in May?
I'll still need to sort out my comments, but I've taken a ton of notes, and I think it'll be very beneficial to talk with cities one-on-one directly to get into some of those more technical, detail-oriented questions. I hope that when we come back in May, we'll have a more refined set of alternatives that will have more input behind it that we can discuss at that point.
And if anybody from the public or the city would like to provide comments, you could send them to VTA, and then VTA will be able to send them out to us. And anybody other last comments, I think? Okay. Thank you for all. We're a little bit over, but thank you for the comments and your participation.